Awesome. So we are starting with the recording, therefore we can start with our symposium dialogue. Again, thank you to everyone who has joined us. This is an intimate symposium with Dr. Sibusiso Maseko, who's bound to lead the discourse on white nationalism, specifically white nativism, and its arc in post-apartheid South Africa. So Dr. Sibu Maseko was so happy that you have graced us with your presence and with your expertise. We're very excited for this conversation. My name is Ayabulela Mhlahlo. I am a PhD student at the University of Connecticut, but more importantly, I'm a member of the Black House Collective, and I'm also the key facilitator of our Philosopher in Soweto series. So for those of you guys who don't know what the Philosopher in Soweto series is, the Philosopher in Soweto series is an initiative that we started, headed by Zandi Khadebe, who's the leader of the organization. She started it in 2013, I believe, and we have basically, hosted a variety of scholars, including Lewis Gordon, all of these being global scholars, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Professor C.K. Raju, who speaks on colonialism and mathematics and data science, and how important is it for us to have that specific conversation. We've also hosted names such as Sadia Hatman. And before this iteration, we even had people like Frank Wilderson, at the Blackwash, also speaking on his work. So we've hosted some of the most important scholars in our field in Black studies and decolonial theory in the 21st century. And we think of ourselves as a 21st century intellectual and revolutionary movement. And so we think that, having these intellectual spaces is really important in terms of engineering and continuing to cultivate the kind of society that we think is important, or we think would be just for our people and other oppressed people the world over. So that's basically our motive, and that's who we are. I'm going to briefly read from our manifesto in terms of why we're here, and again with more emphasis on who we are as Black House Collective, specifically the Philosopher in Soweto series. As I said right now, we are relaunching our platform in a new wave of hybrid and online intellectual symposiums and public lectures by esteemed global philosophers and Azania's young generation of groundbreaking scholars, SMU being part of that legion. As I've said, we have been honored to host esteemed scholars like C.K. Raju, Oyoronke Oyewumi, the late Charles Mills, Mabuche More, Mogobe Ramose, Sadia Hadman, Nelson Maldonado Torres, and Lewis Gordon, amongst others. We are excited to announce this new installment of the Black House Collective's Philosopher series, which we are calling Philosophizing in Soweto series, obviously philosophizing digitally, with participants from different ends of the globe. With this new iteration, we hope to host an array of younger, upcoming Black scholars from all corners of scholarship who are working on what we identify as pivotal questions that have the potential to channel the unfolding trajectories of 21st century Black radical intellectual scholarship. We also hope to foreground anti-hegemonic intellectuals who are working from independent institutions of public production or knowledge production. We firmly believe that self-driven and Black radical knowledge production is a key factor of generating and engineering what our tradition envisages or sees as the revolutionary paradigm, or rather the blueprint which shall channel the manifestation of a world that fits our vision of justice and power. We are thus involved in the long genealogy of Black radical knowledge producers who attempt to work against the current of the dominant colonial discursive field and the world it reproduces and recultivates at every turn of its continuum. With this new iteration, we hope to contribute to the greater revolutionary program of cultivating an anti-colonial world-building paradigm that not only anticipates but cultivates a world suited for life. That's our manifesto. Now, to introduce our talk today, we say that the first event to launch the new iteration of Black House Collective Philosopher Philosophizing in Soweto series will be a symposium on the refurbished discursive patterns of white supremacist rhetoric in occupied Azania and the colonial world writ large, with claims of white nativism or white indigeneity, as well as the resurgence of white power rhetorical channels in the colonial sphere we call the colonial state. We ponder on this series of questions which Sbu will lead us or guide us in unraveling. The first question is, what is the state as a colonial machine of war and anti-Black / anti-indigenous power structure? How do we think of apartheid not merely as a regime of governance, but a global order of power and tactic of war against the so-called native? What are the rhetorical and discursive mechanisms that enable whiteness to reproduce itself as an order of power? How do fictions of white nativism function as colonial war programs to destabilize and delegitimize Black consciousness and revolutionary programs of reclaiming stolen land and rechanneling the destinies of the oppressed masses in the colonial sphere? So this is basically the conversation we'll have with Smu. I will invite my colleague Uzweli, my colleague and comrade Zweli, to introduce Dr. Smu Maseko. Smu will then take us to a 15-minute sort of like, exposition of what he calls white nativism and the work that it is doing and re-entrenching, the colonial paradigm. And then we'll open up a discussion for around 40 minutes with the House, with everyone who is here today, around basically some of the key questions and concerns that Smu is raising. And so that's the symposium form of our discussion, right? Smu being the leader as an expert, but all of us are basically encouraged to participate. One thing I must say is that this meeting is obviously being recorded, as you all know. And secondly, this meeting will also be published on different social media platforms such as Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. So if you want to keep yourself anonymous, but you want to say something, you're definitely welcome to do so. I do encourage people to open their videos, but if you don't want to do that, again, that is welcomed. So if you want to keep your anonymity, that's fine. But also if you want to, show yourself in public, since this will be published and publicized, that is also fine as well. But thank you to everyone who made time to being here. Thank you to Lutando Ngema for giving us our recording rights. And thank you, more importantly, to Sibusiso Maseko for giving us his time and his brilliant mind. Zweli, if you may introduce our speaker for today.
All right. Thank you, Sis Aya. I don't know if I get the option to be anonymous, but nginibulise ngithi sanibonani. Mangiqeda ukunibulisa ngicela nje nihlale limamele ilivi lami ngoba ngishaya ngisiqangane. All right. Good evening to all of you. I am Zwelinkani. Welcome, Dlalose, and allow me to take the liberty to express my gratitude to everyone in attending this auspicious event that marks the relaunch of Black House Collective's Philosopher in Soweto series. I'm more than confident, allow me to say, that I'm sure that in no time whatsoever, this platform is to become a most prominent Black radical intellectual corner in South Africa's political, social, and conceptual discourse. All right, so before introducing this evening's guest, my intellectual hotman, Dr. Sibusiso Maseko, I think it's best to first lay out the backdrop, or rather the context in which this evening's conversation takes place. This context is the political development that gained prominence recently with the signing of the Expropriation Act of 2024, which is an act that establishes the framework for the expropriation of land by the South African government. Despite the tame nature of the act, as well as the fact that the act is in line with common practice across the world, specifically in terms of the government's power, right, across the world of eminent domain, which refers to the right of a government to expropriate private property for public use. And despite this fact, US President Donald Trump still saw it fit to represent this non-development really of South Africa's political, well, within South Africa's political arena as, quote, terrible things. I wish I could do the Donald Trump voice, but anyway, terrible things are happening in South Africa. He wrote in his Truth Social account. South Africa is confiscating land, which is, of course, as we all know, blatantly false, and treating certain classes of people badly. He continued to say, referring to South Africa's white minority population, who are, mind you, statistically among the most privileged class of people in the world. After threatening to cut future funding to South Africa, Trump subsequently went further as to offer refugee status to Afrikaners, a proposal they, of course, unsurprisingly declined. The subject around which we gather here this evening, and what was surprising to many, including myself, was the reason which Afrikaner political representatives presented for their rejection of this foolish offer, citing their claim to nativity within South Africa. In a press conference addressing these developments, CEO of AfriForum, Kali Kriel, said, thank you, Kali Kriel said this, and I quote, we see our future in Africa. Our people became a people here on the southern tip of Africa. We did not develop elsewhere. We are not Europeans. We have Germans, Europeans, Dutch coming as Europeans, but we became a people here. We are indigenous to this country and we are not going anywhere. Now, regardless of the strength and conviction behind this assertion, there is clearly a contradiction to the statement, right? Like, how are we able to acknowledge that they come from elsewhere, yet they are indigenous to here? I had to go to Google Dictionary and check what is the meaning of this indigenous. It said that indigenous is a figure of speech. It is an adjective which means it is a word that defines a person or a thing. It goes on to define indigenous as a person or a thing originating or occurring naturally in a particular place, a person or a thing that is to say native to a particular place. A truly instructive example Google gives is of the use of the word as follows. Coriander is indigenous to Southern Europe, right? And yet Afrikaners who acknowledge that they originate from Europe claim to be native to South Africa. How? How, Sway? How? To help us grapple with these complex intersections of colonial history, identity politics, and the ever-evolving definition of nativity is our expert guest this evening, brother, Dr. Maseko. He is a senior lecturer at the University of South Africa's Department of Psychology. He earned his doctorate degree in psychology from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in 2023. Drawing on South Africa's history of settler colonialism, his broad research agenda focuses on how white South Africans assert themselves as natives to maintain a sense of territorial entitlement. His current research examines how white South Africans mobilize their sense of belonging using settler mythologies as well as collective nostalgia to defend their ownership of their settler colonial territory and to maintain racial inequality. Mfo Maseko, please guide
Yes,
me,
yes,
guide
sir.
us, guide us. How did this
Uh,
happen, my brother? When and
yeah,
why? How,
yeah.
when, and why did Afrikaners become Africans? Please,
Yes,
it's
yes,
your
yes,
floor,
yes.
sir.
Thank you, Zwelingani. Thank you very, very much for a generous, generous introduction. And I thank you very much for inviting me to this platform. And thank you to Zandi Khatebe, my colleague from the University of South Africa. I think you guys have given me a very difficult task, because this is a question, or rather, the question of white nativeness has been a question that has you could say, preoccupied me for a while, for more than 5 years. And I think growing up, the question of white South Africans and I've always just growing up, I grew up at Tembisa, in the township, and I'd go to, the burbs of Parktown, and I'd meet white people, and I'd get the political education I see from other black people. And I've always just wondered, why don't they get it? So my preoccupation, I think, with white South Africans is very deep. And I've, through sort of, writing about my research, I've sort of traced it back to my early childhood, where one moved, between Ilogishi and the burb, so I think I've been thinking about them for a while, and my thesis then offered me the opportunity to, to really try to understand, and I think one's understanding obviously comes from a deep rage, comes from a deep anger, comes from the experience of racism in South Africa, I mean, yeah, I mean that we all have countless events where we have been called the K word in South Africa. I experienced that in the suburbs. So there's always been this curiosity around white South Africans and why don't they get it? But thank you again, guys, from the Black House Collective, and even our guests for making time, and for some of you for engaging my work and getting into my train of thought. I think my role today, as Aya said, is to kickstart the conversation, and then I hope that we'll get into a discussion where I could also learn. This, I think, is my 2 cents worth around white Afrikaners, white South Africans, English South Africans, etc. So I've got a couple of notes that I'm going to be reading off from, and I'll try and speak in a sort of informal tone as well, particularly because it's a Friday and I think people may be a bit tired. And I've got a glass of water. I promise it's nothing else but water. So I think the background to tonight's symposium is, are Afrikaners African? And it's relevant in this moment because we know that the Trump administration and AfriForum as racial kin have been having very close discussions about the positioning of white South Africans, in particular Afrikaners, South Africans. And perhaps one could call this a resurgence of white Afrikaner nationalism. And at the same time, one cannot help but wonder or look at the irony that these political repercussions that are coming from the United States are also because of the settler colonial situation in Israel and Palestine, where South Africa took Israel to the International Crimes Court. And that, I think, is the irony, right? There's a sort of a dynamic around settler colonialism that has sort of played out in our political landscape. The recent events and the questions, are Afrikaners Africans, dovetails nicely with chapter 1 of my doctoral dissertation and now working paper that seeks to explain how white settlers in South Africa come to see themselves as native and eventually autochthonous first inhabitants of South Africa's colonial lands. In other words, how does a group that should constitute an immigrant population render itself more native than the indigenous inhabitants? In light of this, then, allow me to respectfully rephrase the question and perhaps ask, how do white settlers become native? Or how do they impose themselves as Africans who are native? And what are the consequences of their assertion of nativeness? And this, I guess, this has been the central, focus of my research work. This is what has really preoccupied me over time, as I said earlier on. This question has preoccupied me because I think in South Africa, we're not exclusively dealing with a problem of white identity per se, right? or a problem of white Afrikaner nationalism. But I think we're dealing with a problem of white entitlement to settler colonial lands, right? There's a scholar from Australia, Morton Robertson, I cite her highly. She, in describing Australia as an indigenous scholar, speaks of Australia as a white possessive, right? This place or this sovereign state, national state, where whites or whiteness owns the space. And this is this is some of the work that has sort of shaped my thinking. And in really arguing that the problem in South Africa is really white entitlement to settler colonial lands, I'm speaking to the broader community. I know this is a very, very specific community. I think in South Africa, we've obsessed about the national identity, right? That is the rainbow nation, right? And in being obsessed with the national identity, the rainbow nation, this melting pot of different races, we've stopped to ask ourselves the more difficult questions about why are white South Africans entitled? Why do they feel as though they're the owners of South Africa as a sovereign territory? And in our focus and in our sort of brainwashing in the early 90s, 1994, and this so-called freedom and the end of apartheid, we've missed this pertinent question. And as I combed through the literature, I found that this question was not asked enough, right? The question of white permanence. I think a useful theoretical framework that has shaped my thinking to understand South Africa as a settler colony is settler colonial theory, right? We know in society that people who think of South Africa as this utopian, place where, we've accepted a liberal democracy and everybody lives equally. But if we think of South Africa as a settler colony, then we begin to ask, I think, questions that are more pertinent. Settler colonial theory helps us understand South Africa not as a liberal democracy, but as a settler colony. It argues that settler colonies are characterized by the following, right? It argues that settler colonies are characterized by the elimination of indigenous inhabitants, right? This is called the logic of elimination. So in other words, settler colonial conquest seeks to eliminate indigenous inhabitants. It then, in principle, also focuses on the appropriation of indigenous land, right? The taking of indigenous land and making them the white possession. It is also obsessed with the racial classification of indigenous people, but which we've had quite extensively in South Africa. But I think what is also very interesting for me, it is also characterized by the permanent presence of white settlers in settler colonies. And in settler colonies, white settlers come to stay. They do not come to leave and then go back to the empire. So settler colonization is a distinct sort of form of colonization that or at least I argue, is at the core of how South Africa is shaped. Now, there's some controversy around settler colonial theory because one of the you could say the foremost theoreticians on settler colonial theory, Patrick Wolf, he sort of casts a doubt on South Africa being a settler colony, right? And one of the reasons for this is that, the indigenous inhabitants, us, Black South Africans, have not been wiped out. And through the logic of elimination, right? But I think I've always wondered that he perhaps has not considered that the logic of elimination is not just a physical elimination of a people, but it can also be an abstract, more metaphysical elimination of a people. So I use this theory and I insist on this theory where some have argued that it's not relevant to South Africa as a theory that is central to that has shaped my work. Another important piece of work that I've used to shape my work is work by Vivian Reddy. He's a political theorist, I think, from UCT, and he writes a book on settler colonization and the failures of a liberal democracy. And in that book, what he broadly does is critique, the liberal democracy that is in South Africa, and argues that South Africa is indeed a settler colony because the vast majority of Black South Africans cannot even exercise their rights. So yeah, these are the theories that have shaped my work and my arguments. Right. The central argument, right, of my work is to really explain how white settlers become native. I argue that white settlers have constructed settler mythologies that make them de facto natives, but that these settler mythologies also grossly undermine and outrightly deny Black South Africans' indigeneity, and they also animate white autochthony, right? And by white autochthony, I mean that they animate white autochthony in the sense that autochthony is the belief that the first inhabitants of a territory are more entitled. The first inhabitants of a territory should enjoy superior rights. So my argument is that not only do these settler mythologies make white South Africans, in this case white settlers, feel more native, that they're from South Africa, but that they also are first inhabitants who should enjoy rights that are much more superior than the indigenous inhabitants. This, of course, naturally leads to the rejection of land reparation measures. What are then settler mythologies, right? Settler mythologies can be thought of as a set of elaborate reconstructions of history, which reflects settler fantasies and disavowals, right? Settler mythologies form part of the everyday practices of white settlers. In other words, settler mythologies become normative, unquestioned, and form part of the mundane social practices of settler colonies, right? So, and what I'm really trying to do with this focus on mythology is that, in essence, when you look at how white South Africans write about, let's say, land reparations, in the Democratic Alliance and in the AfriForum documents, which I'll reference, they rely on sort of this misremembering of history. They obfuscate history, they change it around, they refashion it in their own liking in order to justify themselves as natives, right? But they also settler mythologies also have a level of fantasy in them, right? You will see in some of the earlier work, or rather in the work in settler colonial studies by Veracini, he speaks about how settlers prior to coming to the settler colony had these grand fantasies of a promised land, right? So settler mythologies are also rooted in this fantasy, in this wishful thinking, right? That sort of seeks to wish away the native inhabitants a lot of the time, or native history a lot of the time, and the culture that native people have. What you will also find with settler mythologies, as I'll try to illustrate, is that settler mythologies contain disavowals, right? These are deep denials, right, of settler colonial violence. You'll see settlers speaking about the peaceful exchange of land, right? And these are very deep narratives that they've become invested in, right? So what are these mythologies that I speak of, right? Well, the first mythology that I really try to focus on is the empty land mythology. And the second mythology that I'm going to speak about is the Bantu migration mythology. And these mythologies also work together. I separate them, but I think they work together. And in particular, the Bantu migration mythology and the empty land mythology, or the vacant land mythology, as it's called, I try to trace the continuity of these mythologies in a text by the Democratic Alliance, which is a text about land reform, right? Everybody is aware of the Democratic Alliance, which is the official, well, used to be the official opposition, now a GNU partner in South Africa's government. And then our infamous AfriForum, our deputy government that is going over in the US and lobbying its white counterparts. AfriForum also released a document or a report that is also a position paper on land reparations in South Africa. So I try to, in my work, what I really do is I first locate these mythologies in history and how they've been utilized through the colonial era, and then I attempt to trace them, or rather trace their continuities in these two texts. But before I get into the Bantu migration mythology and the empty land mythology, I'd like to also illustrate how mythologies work. And this is, as I was preparing, this is an idea I had, is that to show how to illustrate how mythologies function with reference to the farm murder mythology. So we all know that AfriForum mobilizes this myth of white farm murders, right? As one of, the case in points for their oppression and their genocide, the white genocide, the apparent white genocide, right? And the farm murder mythology has gained currency, even though we know that it's outlandish. It's an outlandish claim. It has no objective basis, but it somehow has found resonance in the States, amongst other white nationals, and maybe with some white South Africans, I hope not with Black South Africans. And here we see in sort of in the contemporary, in our moment, how a mythology works, right? In this case, the farm murder mythology functions as a fantasy, right? And it exists in the white South African imagination, right? It has no objective basis. And I think what makes this mythology worse is that not so long ago, we had two farmers being arrested for killing a Black woman and at a farm and feeding her to pigs. So this is not part of the everyday discourse around farm murders, right? But the farm murders are the murders of white people. And statistically, it's very, very small. And we're now not even talking about the issue of the Black woman who was fed to the pigs by white farmers. This does not make the popular discourse. So the historical understanding of the empty land myth, Oysen in her work, in her examination of the moral justifications of settler colonization, alludes to how white settlers in South Africa employed the empty land mythology to justify land dispossession based on the premise that land was occupied, or unoccupied rather, by indigenous groups when they settled. Now, my view is that this mythology also functions as a projection. It's not that white settlers found the land empty, but it was because they did not see Africans as people. Hence, they emptied the land. Second, it functions based on the idea that land that was uncultivated, right? Uncultivated can be considered vacant and no man's land. So historically, this is how, the empty land mythology functions. And in my thesis, I make reference to it quite extensively. But what I want to do is also in this talk is share how this mythology has sort of morphed or has been repurposed. I like the word I uses, has been refurbished, right? In the present day by AfriForum and the DA in the papers around land reparations in South Africa, right? Now, I'm just going to share my thoughts of the mythologies and how these mythologies then you could say they surface in these texts as discursive practices, right? And what what the AfriForum does in their positioning paper is that they then sort of create this elaborate narrative that when they settled in South Africa, there was no man's land, but they say that the Bantu tribes, as they say, wiped each other out, right? They argue that it was through barbaric warfare, and they point to certain protagonists like Mzilikazi and Ushaka to say that, we found the land empty because the natives were barbaric. They engaged in warfare and they killed each other off. I'll quote one of the excerpts from the text. They say the rise of the mighty Zulu nation led to the widespread disruption and extinction of various tribes in the years between 1818 and 1835. Right? And then another excerpt from that is that they speak of a historian, I think he's a historian, Andres Pretorius. Andres Pretorius gave an account of his journey to the interior, describing scenes of destroyed native villages piled with bones of the dead, and how small tribes were forced to eat their own children because of the constant persecution and destruction by the bloodthirsty and repercussions stronger tribes, right? So you can see that AfriForum is able to sort of recycle the old empty land mythology and repurpose it as a discourse of a savage indigene, right? They were barbarians. They were barbarians. They killed each other off. When we landed in the Cape and we started moving inwards through the Great Trek, we found South Africa destroyed, right? This is the story they're telling, right? What they've also done, what AfriForum does in continuing these mythologies is that they also peddle this idea that Black South Africans are not interested in land, right? They call it the no hunger for land. Like, we do not want land. We want to exist in urban areas. And this is what we want to do. We've got no desire to work. Yeah. What they also do is that they've got this discourse of productive land, right? They draw on the historical idea that land that was barren, unused, and therefore vacant, should then or constituted empty land. And in doing, in doing land reparations, then land must be productive. So there's this suggestion that in giving land to Black South Africans, the land will not be productive because of the emphasis on land being productive. And the DA do a similar thing, right? The DA's document or positioning paper on land reform is squarely focused, right? It narrows the debate of land and land reparations as just land that must be used as a productive asset. Issues of justice, of social justice, are minimized, right? So land is actually there to be extracted, and this is a very Western worldview of how they think about land, right? Now, white settlers also, through the colonial era, have also peddled this very elaborate claim as well, right? And I think this elaborate claim really is targeted at Black South Africans, right? I think what makes South Africa distinct to some settler colonies is that, the indigenes, the natives, us Black South Africans are here, right? And we dwarf them in numbers. And I think the Bantu migration myth is one of those as well that seek to sort of undermine our indigeneity as Black South Africans, right? In my text, I write that complementing the empty land mythology is the Bantu migration mythology. This mythology contends that Bantu-speaking groups came to South Africa from the northern parts of Africa around the same time as Afrikaners and English-speaking South Africans. Furthermore, the myth suggests that Bantu-speaking South Africans, subsequent to their settlement, acquired territory through colonial conquest, right? Recently, Laband, a historian, provided a description of the Bantu migration, mythology, stating, of all the people living in South Africa today, only the San are considered autochthonous, right? By autochthonous, we mean first peoples who have greater rights. That is still living in the same region as their ancestors when they evolved into modern humans eons ago. Everyone else in this story were settlers, people who came later, were migrating further north in Africa, like the Khoikhoi and Southern Nguni speakers, or arriving by sea, like the Portuguese, Dutch, French, British, Germans, or Madagascar and East Indies, and elsewhere in Africa if they slaves, right? So already, I mean, Laband, this is written in 2020, right? John Laband is a prominent historian and who specializes in, apparently he's a specialist in Anglo-Zulu history. Now, here we see a very contemporary scholar drawing on a historical, idea then that colonial idea, in fact, that, everyone here is a settler, right? In order to relegate Black South Africans to status of not being native, right? Yeah. And I think, the more recent rendition in the documents that I mentioned, the AfriForum land document and the DA land document, is that they do this very interesting, or they make this very interesting shift where they really put land into sort of compartments, right? As urban land and rural land, right? And they focus on this kind of interior migrations of, the Bantu, as they say. And this I think is really very, very, very interesting. One of the texts says, under the leadership of Shaka, the once obscure Zulu nation became the dominant group in the area that was responsible for the large-scale displacement and extinction of other smaller tribes. The conflict spilled over into the interior and resulted in the greatest migration of people in recent history. As a result, very few Bantu-speaking tribes still live in the same place that they did in 1815, right? And this is a really fitting illustration, right? So the Bantu have also moved around internally, so they do not own land, right? They just nomadic people that really we cannot say they own land. And what this text is really saying, it's actually the fault of Uchaga, that the Bantu don't own land. There was war and an internal migration, and yeah, this is a worrying sort of a depiction, obviously, of Bantu migration, as they call it. And it's clear that this overt attempt at undermining our rights as indigenous and as natives of South Africa, right? But I think what it also shows us is there's a projection of, these colonial borders, and these ideas that these colonial borders, are theirs, and they've got the right to tell us where South Africa starts, begins, where Limpopo starts, ends, or begins, or where the Zulu belong, the Xhosa, and this idea. So to close off, these are sort of my parting shorts. How white settlers employ settler mythologies to make themselves native points to the fact that in their political imagination, they see themselves as autochthonous, right? In other words, as people who are first inhabitants and who should enjoy greater rights. And in the sense that they are autochthonous, they render Black South Africans as immigrants, right? Nomads who do not belong, who came from up north, and then they through the war that they had, Mfecane, caused by Umzilikazi and Shaka Zulu, the blacks then scattered all over, so they do not own land, and how these settler mythologies are employed really tells us that white settlers are really or think of themselves as autochthons, and they are beyond belonging. They don't just belong to South Africa, right? They are part of South Africa. They became a people, as Zweli stated earlier on. And yeah, are Afrikaners Africans? I don't know. I hope I've answered that question, and I hope it's clear that where I stand. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Sbu. Okay, I'm trying to open my camera. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you so much, Sbu. That was incredibly beautiful and brilliant as always. What we're going to do now is we're going to open up discussion to the House, to the general public here for around 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will conclude. Obviously, I have my remarks and questions, but I will be more liberal as chair and then prioritize others before I come with my own questions and remarks. So would anyone want to go first in terms of like commenting or expanding or just wanting to open up different channels of discussion based on how Sbu has sort of led us to think about the question as not, are they Africans or whatever, because it's not an ontological question, it's a political question. And as Sbu is revealing very well in his use of mythology and narrative, and how these are constructed for political end, we see that this is a discursive question. So it's how, these ideas are sort of like injected into what Sbu calls, this sort of like narrative paradigm or discursive paradigm. And, then they become normalized, instrumentalized, and concretized through education systems and various other ways in which discourse is sort of like distributed and also becomes and transforms and is codified into power. So the question, as he says, is let's focus on the process rather than asking questions of essence, right? Because questions of essence will lead us to another path that we might not want to take. So thank you so much, Sbu. By critically reconstructing the question, you're making us think about processes and mechanisms in how, people are situated into identities that either make them powerful or make them powerless. So I think just having that kind of like illuminations from Dr. Maseko, or perhaps we can also begin to think about, other ways of thinking about this problem. So I'm going to open up questions and remarks to the House, and please raise your hand, and then we can take it from there. Anyone? Okay, people are shy today. Okay.
I think it's a burning question. It's a burning question. I think I'll also probably reflect on the question that you ask as well. Are Afrikaners African? I think what's fascinating in sort of my readings, but I don't really include a lot of that in my thesis, is that post apartheid, post 1994, you find a lot of white Africana identity work and a lot of white South African identity work as well, and the 94 sort of ensued this white crisis of identity where there's dozens of texts where they really asking themselves the question that frames our discussion today, about whether they're Africans,
Yeah.
Obviously the issue with that, the political issue with that is that not so long ago, the benches were written in Afrikaans, not for Europeans.
Yeah.
So there's a crisis of identity that also just ensued there. And I thought that the question that you posed was interesting as the framing question.
Absolutely. But I think when we talk about identity, we also need to think about it as transformative, or it transforms in different political environments, right? So for example, as you're saying, in certain benches, certain demarcations, you'd find things like Europeans only. And the Europeanness of white people in South Africa during apartheid was so deeply entrenched because remember, the South African state as we know it, is what now, 110 years old, 115 years old. So there's also that question of South Africa as a settler colony, as an extension of various empires. And so the shift then in ways in which the settler colonialism of itself, right, the very essence of it sort of, transforms in how the white American also transforms into an indigenous creature, after, the independence and after the Civil War. And it's no longer, us as the British or us as the Italian, but more in the 20th century, it becomes us as Americans. So I think there's interesting processes there. And it's not only just a question about white settlers in South Africa, but white settlers globally. And Israel is one of the most extreme examples where, the settler sort of entrenches themselves into the very so-called essence of the place in which that they colonize and then sort of transform themselves as the first and foremost principle of existence in that place. They become the indigenous, so yeah, I think that's really important to note. Let me give Zweli and then I'll go back to you, Smooth, to respond. Zweli.
No, thank you very much, Sis Aya. Brother Small, thank you so much for the incredible talk, very, very instructive. Speaking of it being instructive, I'd like to speak to this useful distinction that Sis Aya raised of between process and essence. Ukuthi njengoba sihlangene lana, you are guiding us through the process by which the European becomes African. But I'd also like to also emphasize the importance of, synthesizing it down to the essence, so that we can have a concrete language that we can use. Okay, lo muntu mangithi Afrikaner, what do I mean? Like that everyone can use. There was a suggestion coming from high above. I won't say where. It's a secret. But the suggestion was that rather than referring to them as Afrikaners, we refer to them as Dutchlanders. You know what I mean? As a way of identifying them when they are trying to morph into this new, political creature that disperses or dislocates us. So.
No, that's interesting. So maybe explain further, really. Then I'll invite you to, because I think I'm also new to this idea, and I think also mentioned this. Oh, what do you guys mean by essence? Then I could also just pick up a thing or two. And the difference? Because yes, my work sort of is a work that sort of outlines how the settler, using Mamdani, borrowing Mamdani, becomes sort of native, right? So by essence, what do you guys mean?
Okay, so
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, we mean what is a Afrikaner? Yeah, they mustn't come trick us, and because mind you, we are confused now. And I guess linked to that is what is an African? Because we need to also address that in order to be able to create, programs to address and you know what I mean.
For sure.
Yeah, but I also want to clarify these questions philosophically, since we are in a philosopher series, right? So in philosophy, there's different ways of sort of identifying, this question of existence or something that exists. Primarily, it's through this question of essence or this category called essence or ontology, meaning that a thing is a thing outside of any kind of production or any kind of transformation. So Smoo retains his essence despite, him being hit or encountering any other kind of phenomena. So Smoo will be Smoo in mass. Smoo will be Smoo in an alternative reality in the 14th century or whatsoever, right? That's the question of essence. But in politics, we understand identity through process and through production. And that's why I think your restructuring of the question is so important, because as we see these identities and how they're formulated, I mean, even when Steve Biko, makes the distinction between non-white and Black, he's making a political distinction, or he's sort of generating a political production there, because he says that the non-white, as we know them, is like a creature, something created as, as an identity that stifles our political action, right? It's like that's given to us, and it is more of like a war tool, It is like it's a war tool that disables our politics. And so I think in thinking about whiteness and sort of like, casting the eye or casting the gaze back to, so-called power and hegemony, I think what your work does, and making sort of these different demarcations that you're beginning to make, is you're also inviting us to think about the different processes in which whiteness refurbishes, as I was saying earlier on, how it refurbishes, reconstructs itself in order to constantly consolidate both its power and capital. And so my is this on this question of land and capital, right? Or land and property. I think what you spoke about is really important, in saying that land for the white colonizer, for the white capitalist, is not a question of like, a cultural demarcation or cultural entity that is shared between, all these people who are involved in the society and animal inhabitants and various other kind of living or ancestral inhabitants, as we often think about it in our philosophies, but land is property. And so when whiteness sort of like, and given that, I mean, over 80% of South Africa's private property is in white hands, right? When you think about land as property and understanding that that property, belongs, I suppose, to white people, as it was also constructed by white people, specifically those in the bourgeoisie. Like, do Afrikaners become African in the ways that they own Africa? So I think that's the Walter Rodney kind of question, right? Like that question of property and political economy, in that, the Afrikaner can claim Africa because the Afrikaner owns large stakes in Africa.
I think, sorry to add, and sorry, we can get. I think you make me think of the work of Cheryl Harris, the seminal work of Cheryl Harris, right? Well, whiteness is of property, and I think that's what you guys are saying when you speak of essence, and now it's clicking, because Cheryl Harris's work was probably one of the earlier works as well, that shaped my thinking, right? Because Cheryl Harris speaks of whiteness as possession, right? And she studies it in the United States of America, and she speaks about whiteness as property, right? White people owning land and owning people as well as slaves, right? So this essence called whiteness owns, in essence, right? Its ontological makeup is an entity that owns land and property. And without owning land, I mean, land and people, it ceases to be white, right? It doesn't exist as whiteness, as So I think what you comment and makes me is really, I think casts a light on Cheryl Harris's work, which is also it's a phenomenal body of work. I mean, it's seminal, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that question of property and land as property and the belongingness of land is definitely, or belongingness to land is definitely, in our era of like colonialism and capitalism, is definitely like tied to ownership, right? So the ways in which, the Afrikaner can claim it, or the white can claim some sense of indigeneity or first peopleness. And again, Israel is like the most glaring example, because we're seeing it in its very raw form. The way in which, Trump now wants to become a Gaziite, in a sense, like a citizen and a property owner of Gaza, is definitely, I think, within white identity making, tied to the question of ownership. So my question then is like, for those of us who want to subvert this question and want to sort of like have this sort of like, this clinging onto Africanness, so to speak, how do we think of the belongingness to Africa? You know, because land has always been in politics, it's a terrain, it's a field to play the game. Always has been like that. Territory is conceptualized as like this political terrain to play particular political and economic games. Now, given that we are on the land, but we're on the land as laborers, we're not on the land as players. How do we a belongingness without that major part of being a player, which is being a stakeholder, you know? And I think that's where we get tripped, and that's where the claims of indigeneity and nativeness or nativity shifts from the Black indigenous to now this new construct called the white indigenous. And I'm interested in what you think, but I also want to open
invite.
it
Yes. Let's invite people to talk as well.
Let's see. People are shy today. Interesting. Comrades. Nikona, or is it like a background?
It's Friday, Aya. It's Friday. It's Friday. Lutando's laughing. It's Friday.
We are here, and thank you so much. Very intrigued with the topic. Thank you so much. It's Lutando here. I think something was triggered in me when you were talking, Sbu, about you know, how at some time or at some point the organization of Black society, you didn't put it in those words, but that word triggered in my head. But the organization of Black society became separate, like the spaces for Amazulu, you know, abantu baseLimpopo, you know, that differentiation, or rather that separation then creates this separate Black society. So we don't exist as a holistic Black society in South Africa, if you know what I mean. So that works for breaking us up and breaking maybe the strength of our indigeneity in this space, because it's operating from a space of you are separate, you don't have solidarity as a people. You destroyed each other, and you know, obviously lingering to tribalism and such, which is prominent as well in our society, in our Black society. So what I think as well, or what I then get a sense of, this whole Afrikaner nationalism, which really grew around the 50s, and obviously bringing apartheid really to its form, was this idea of white solidarity, you know, and this whiteness. And I think even today, I wouldn't even say that apartheid has ended necessarily, but it's just morphed in a different way, and it's always trying to find its head. And it's still continuing to do this separation of Black society. Today. So I think that's what's just playing around my head as you were talking. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lutando. Let's hear from Umutomje. I'm so sorry if I'm butchering your name, but please do.
Okay, thank you. It's Mosa. Hey, Dr. Sbo, thanks for your presentation, Food of Thought in this afternoon. So, you know, when you present this, and I'm just thinking about the reality, what is happening today, you know, and when you talk about the white identity, Afrikaner, as we see now, the Afrikaner, they have their own independent city, which is Oran, within South Africa. Secondly, we know they have a project of 3 billion University of Afrikaner that is coming. I think it's in 2028 or 29. And also now we see at Pretoria, they have e-hailing, which is Afrikaner, you know, it's all about Afrikaner, which is now they are putting their footprint, you know, that we are also a nation in this country. And even they've shown us when Trump was giving them refugee, they say, no, thanks, we don't even need
We're
that.
fine, yeah.
We belong here. So I'm just saying, in our Black community, what are we saying? Are we ignoring what is happening? That there's a new, there's a new trend of Afrikaners identifying themselves again, as we're coming from Rand Afrikaans University, but there's a 3 billion African university that is coming. What the Black society it's saying about this new trend of independent city or province within Africa of white. So
Thanks,
that was,
Thank you. Should I take both, Aya?
Yeah, definitely take both, Sbu.
Okay. I think I'll take the first one by Lutando. Yeah, Lutando, I think that's and this is something I've been thinking about for a while, and perhaps people who are more learned in the audience can tell us. But I'm yet to find texts that speak to Black indigenous identity, because my suspicion is that AbeZulu, AmaHlubi, and these were nations in and of themselves. And umZulu in the contemporary, from apartheid's view, Yamabantustan, Xhosa, Tswana, from that Bantustan projection, is also an invention of an identity, right? So it seems as though these are projections of the white imaginary, even the very identity that we hold, right? And the deeper question is, you'd find, I remember back in the day, you'd find a lady who's like, no, I'm not Xhosa, we are a nation, and we've been written out. And I think that becomes the work that I think we need to do. I haven't come across that work where we also need to historicize our identity again, because clearly these are projections of, white settlers, with a particular agenda to say umZulu is distinct from Umxhosa is distinct from San even, right? Yeah, I think that even bothers me a lot, like the idea that we are phenotypically, genetically distinct from San, right? From San people, the first people. It's like, and what evidence do they have of that, right? Jesus, and I don't think they were able to draw any archaeological evidence, even in their language. Where's the archaeological evidence to say, they stand today here, these are a people that are distinct. The Black South Africans, the identity that you give them as Black South Africans, are distinct from San, right? And then, Lutando, what you're saying becomes quite pertinent, where you then see, the First Nations people. I always find that very strange, lobbying with the Afrikaners, allyship, haven't you seen that there's this movement where they lobby with Afrikaners to say they are the First Nations, everyone else here, in line with what Lavant is saying. So there's a splitting of identities between, at least how I've read it, between who is San, who is Ikon, there's a way of pronouncing it, I can't pronounce it, and who is a Black South African, and Black South African within that is Bantu, Xhosa, just, but who organized these identities in this way? Right. And I don't know who's done some authoritative work. And if I find it great, if I don't, I'll probably have to do it. But yeah. So yeah. So that's the first thing, Lutan. So I think you bring up a very important point. Also, you're correct. Orania, you have the Cape Independence Movement, right? That has also come up. And I follow them, various advocacy groups, and I will be studying them and focusing on sort of homeland making amongst white settlers. But this is a concern. We do need to be concerned as a people to say, how is it possible that white settlers can come into settled territory, our land, and then negate our right to sovereignty and then create a state within a state, right? And I think once we get there, I don't know. I can already see that's chaos. I think we're moving towards, Israel, Gaza, in that. If that were to happen, I think, demarcations are going to be, very, very dangerous. But okay.
Yeah. I think one thing we have failed to do as Black scholars both in the 20th century and now in the 21st century is, and I think it's something that's important that you're doing, is Black scholars critically studying or deeply entrenched in whiteness studies. But another thing is that we don't historicize, nor do we globalize whiteness and its emergence, right? Because the very same tactics, as you're right to make the association between, the tactics of land hoarding, because that's exactly what it is, right? And sort of like, encoding that land holding as hoarding rather as property, various other projects, whether they be architectural or they be industrial or various other sorts, right? Encoded into policy in neoliberal constitutions in South Africa, in the protection of private property and the like. All of that is basically synchronous with the very same strategies that white people have used in right? At the center of the 21st century. And those are also synchronous in how they expand themselves in the Americas. Very different as well in how they've completely taken over what we now call Latin America, which is South America. So you're right in saying that the elimination is not only, in terms of like physical genocide or this so-called cultural cleansing, the elimination is still in process.
For sure.
That's why people don't understand that, like the haste we need to have as academics and as activists, and sort of really understanding like the war machinery that comes with Europe and that comes with whiteness, and in terms of like its various procedures, right? And how long procedures take to implement and to concretize, and how they then are just like mirrored back into the discursive economy and normalized, as law, as culture, right? So I think if we first study all of this through a philosophy of war, that Europe has always been really prominent in its war strategy from the medieval ages, even the classical ages. Europe has always been a warring society. This is something that we've expected for almost 5,000 years now, actually. So when you study antiquity, when you study classics, it's nothing but literatures and histories of war, right? And people think of war to be, just this brute form, but war is primarily about expansion. America is such a good example. South Africa is a good example. So I think we need to think about ways in which, when we study whiteness, we think about it transhistorically and we think about it transgeographically, because the way in which whiteness expands itself in South Africa is not unique to South Africa. And even with the Trump administration, where these associations, these Nazi associations, this sort of Afrikanerdom, and how it links itself with other kind of white supremacist movements, these networks are becoming more clear to us, but these networks have always been, existing. So yeah, I think we need to really think about the question of war more seriously than we do right now, and not think about political identity as natural. Any questions perhaps from the house, or any comments? I don't want to abuse my discretion as chair. Okay, Lungelo.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for such a fruitful discussion. And I mean, like, listening to smart people talk, there's so much to think about, and there's so much to analyze. And so I genuinely appreciate this session. I guess, a lot has happened. A lot has been happening on my mind. One question, one direct question that I just had initially was, firstly, regarding the Bantu migration mythologies. That we know are mythologies, but what are the alternative true theories, right? That exist out there, and like, how prominent are those, let's say, true theories, right? And so I'd like to hear a bit about that. But also, I just wanted to maybe make a comment around maybe the difficulty of the whole idea of an indigenous identity, you know, and coming to what this indigenous identity, and I always ask myself that, of course, if we are talking about indigenous, and then we take seriously maybe what some scientific theories have said about, you know, Africa being the cradle of life, would that not mean that the whole of humanity is sort of indigenous to Africa, you know, in that kind of superficial, if I can call it that, superficial respect, that, you know, we all started in Africa, so maybe we can claim some sort of indigeneity to Africa. And so the question really is about how far back do we go when we are trying to analyze who's indigenous and who's not. And again, I find it so difficult, but it also touches on the idea of how fluid identity really is, right? And you guys spoke about how, you know, when it was colonization, apartheid, you know, the settlers were able to claim their European identity very easily, and it wasn't a problem. And once, you know, freedom comes, apparently, and they are also able to claim another kind of different, almost contradictory identity, you know, the African identity, you know. And so, of course, we you know, there are a lot of writers on identity who tell us about how fluid identity is. But this is one of the clear examples of how its fluidity is also influenced, in my view, by the kind of resources that settlers have to disseminate information, disseminate their history, disseminate even, you know, their thinking about their own identities and what it means. It's well known, in those questions are well known among white people. And so whenever there is an identity that they can claim, which can be a white identity at some point, but it's a South African identity, now it's an African identity, they are able to do it, and they're able to put resources in such claims. And so, as I think you've said in the settler colonial theory, that part of what settlers do is that they eliminate indigenous. Of course, they didn't kill us, but they eliminated us economically, right, by making us very poor and unable to engage in the very resources that are required to disseminate information about identity and about identity creation. So I also, how can I put it? I do think that it's a question of power, as the speaker said previously, that, you know, a lot of wars have been won by Europeans, and a lot of history has been dictated as a result of such winnings. And a lot of the power today, you know, economic, political, belongs to, you know, the former colonizers. And so they have, you know, the power to actually disseminate whatever information that they can have. And so I guess the final question that I would ask is this difficulty that we are having with identity and indigeneity, could it not also be linked, as I think the speaker said, to the fact of resources, owning serious resources to be able to popularize what we believe are genuine identities? Like you said, the Bantu, going back to my first question, the Bantu migration is a serious mythology, but we don't, as Blacks, we don't know of alternative ideas, we don't know of alternative truths, yet the mythologies are well known. You know, they've been disseminated pretty well, you know. And so how can we, I think one of the, I don't know how to put it, but there seems to be quite a link between this and the identity and the powers people have and the resources people have, and how they are able to resolve their questions of who they are by using these kinds of accesses. And so part of the problem has to do with the elimination part and eliminating indigenous people economically and, you know, politically and whatever. And excuse me, I think I'll stop there for the moment. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Lungelo. Dr. Maseko, before you answer him or respond, N has also posed a question on the chat box, or yeah, they say we may need to look at how, as Black people, we have been psychologically desensitized to our own strengths in opposing the minority Afrikaner and English settlers from overpowering us psychologically, financially, politically, etc. I also wonder how far we are willing to claim land when the Basotho are also looking into reclaiming land in KwaZulu-Natal, for example. Any responses, Swoop?
Yeah, I think I'll start with Lungelo. I think the question that stood out is that, what then is the alternative of, the Bantu mythology, or what are our mythologies about where we originate from, and, or how we come to originate, from the southernmost parts of Africa. There's work by Patrick Mallet, I think, The Lie of 1652. I've perused that book, and I think I still need to speak to historians. Historians can also be very much about, evidence and archives, but Patrick in that book seems to do a lot of the work around, what's the word, of undoing mythologies. I don't know if demythologizing some of these ideas, right? And he asks these questions to say, and I think if we look at it in parallel, we've said that the Afrikaner not so long ago were just recently Afrikaner. They were European, they were African, they were free burghers when they came from the Dutch East India Company and they landed in the Cape. They were free burghers, so their identities have shifted. And Patrick also does a similar way. He said, but how do you know that the Zulu were not Khoi, or they were not San, or in what configuration do they exist? And I think he asked these pertinent questions. So, but his work, I don't know. I've asked some people, and I'm like, do you know this work? What do you think of it? Is it? And I think we need to interrogate such scholars as well and bring them onto this platform, because questions of power, right? Why hasn't such a book been endorsed, or at least been debated, right? Why? Why is, and it's a question of power, right? And if his work is not right, Patrick says, for instance, he sort of digs into the archaeology, and he says that the identity colored, not so long ago, the Cape Flats, based on archaeological evidence, was underwater, right? This is 10,000 years ago, for instance. That's what he says. So, but he was trying to illustrate that identities are very complex and they shift, right? So I think my answer to, not really an answer, but to say, I think there are these works, and part of, I think, this series and this platform is to surface some of those works, and it's for us to then engage the works. I think Black scholars also get subverted and silenced and not get paid attention to, because the ideas that they're bringing are a bit too controversial, and they upset these common, accepted discourses. I don't know. Was the second question related to Basotho claiming land? And
so it's a question from N, and they are basically speaking about our domination and our desensitization to these very political questions, in how we have basically been diminished or overpowered. They say psychologically, financially, and politically. So they're asking you to speak about that. And also they're asking us to think about, the land question, given that land, I think this is an important question that asking, because, land is a terrain of opportunity at the end of the day, right? In economics, it's like the first resource, not just the first resource in which other resources may be mined or whatever, but the first resource in which all kinds of economic and financial relations and even political relations sort of may be mediated. That's the importance of land politically. And it's always been the importance of land, like just universally in terms of in any kind of like political terrain. So in South Africa, where, like over 80% of the land, I don't know what the numbers are now, but over 80% of the land is in white private hands, right? It's white private property. And the state is only left with like 10 to 15%. And also, these indigenous courts, are also, they only have a marginal sector of that land, and more people are trying to kind of claim land. And the majority of us, the majority of Black South Africans, where there is like, where majority of 75% plus are sort of like competing for this very small, sector. Like, again, how do we negotiate our political identity? And I stress political there, following from or not just my identity, unconsciously as a Xhosa or Hlubi woman, not knowing that Xhosaness and Hlubiness and womanness are all these political categories with a stake in the fight, by the way, right? So yeah, I mean, I think this is the type of question that they're asking in terms of like, how do we think about this land, this constrained, land that we have, and our own bargaining for that land, which causes internal rifts and which like misdirects our political action. Nati also has a question, and so does Sis Zandi. So Sis Zandi says, I'm going to read Sis Zandi, we're going to go to Nati, and then Smoo, you will come with responses, right? So Ms. Khatebe, there's a lot of PhD students here, so Smoo, we want to be like you. Some people have even finished their PhDs, but anyways, Sisandi says, in agreement with you, Lungelo, at the core of settler identity and its processes of world making and unmaking lies what one of our associates, Nelson Maldonado Torres, has termed the ethic of war, which is totally right. This concept underscores how settler identity is fundamentally constituted through perversive violence, which manifests not only in overt acts, but also in the structural and epistemic domination that defines coloniality. This ethic of war naturalizes the dispossession, dehumanization, and subordination of indigenous peoples, embedding violence as a ubiquitous and ever-present feature of settler existence and modernity itself. And I think we should have some sessions discussing the problem of modernity, which we will. But I do want to say that these processes are never final in the colonial imagination. The dehumanization isn't after I've stolen the languages, after I've enslaved the ancestors, we're done. It's always ongoing. It's a process of elimination, as you were saying, Smoo. So, Nati, did you have a question or a comment?
I do. Thanks. Can you guys, am I audible? Okay. No, thanks. Yeah, quite an engaging topic. I joined late, just close to your closing, but I did catch the discussion around the question and the Q&A. So that was quite, it actually crystallized for me clearly, because the question is Afrikaners, Africans. It's quite clear that they are, based on what we're discussing. There's a power conversation, land, resources, leading to, they can dictate what identity becomes, right? So essentially the answer is there, that, the fact that they've got the land, the power, the resources, they become what, they are Africans, in the sense of they are in Africa, then, they own African land, etc. Right? So I think that's quite clear. But sorry, then I wanted to add that if you look at in America, for example, right, in terms of identity, Americans don't refer to themselves as European Americans. Also from an identity point of view, when you land in America, it's a prefix and then America. So you're Chinese American or Puerto Rican American. And funny enough, Puerto Ricans are actually probably closest to indigenous. Well, arguably, I know there's also Spanish settlers there, but ultimately, what I want to say is that the Caucasian, white, tends to have the power, the land in America. A similar format, will dictate what identity becomes. I guess where then my struggle in terms of the debate is, and I'm not sure maybe the process, we're trying to answer the question of Afrikaners are Africans by then talking about ourselves as Africans. And then I get, because I answer the question that Afrikaners are Africans, then I'm like, then what am I, as a Black South African, then that's actually quite a conflicting space, because now do I then define or ask about my identity relative to Afrikaner or to other? Let me not even put Afrikaner, to other, to Xhosa, to San, Khoi. And I think that's where the struggle really, in the debate as I'm listening, because I think we tend to defer back to our us as Black Africans, the conversation steers there. And I'm trying to say, I've answered the Afrikaners are African. Now that we that's the answer, do we then, get at least an answer around, who are we? Or is that still a process as well? And also, I guess, like I said, the tension is that I'm having is, if Afrikaners are African, then, who am I? But I see that as a separate debate. Sorry, maybe I wanted to put it that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nati. Definitely, Smoo, I'm happy to hear what you want to say. But I think, Smoo, I don't know what everyone thinks. I think we need to have another talk on myth as a question of power, and we can have that, because you speak about these mythologies, and those mythologies are embedded with other deeper mythologies, as you were saying, with the Israelite question of how white nationalism organizes itself. Again, we see it all over the globe. The Israelites claim to be the true Israelites. Even when Christopher Columbus was voyaging to the Americas, he had with him an intent of finding a new Zion. A lot of people don't know that, but you have to read his diaries. And he had this deeply Christian Abrahamic intent of finding a new kind of Israel, and the idea of himself as Spanish and, as Portuguese, as the people who were the true inhabitants, like the first people, the true Hebrewites, the true Hebraic people. And so this question of first people is not only just a question, when we look at the mythic scopes, it's not just a question of like, oh, the first people of this land. It's the first people of the earth. It's a question of colonizing the earth, dominating the earth and the cosmos in its entirety. And so it's also not a wonder for me that Elon Musk, like in his fantasies of colonization, and remember, Elon Musk is a child of what? Of Canadian Nazis and Afrikaners, South African Afrikaners, specifically those in Pretoria, who have a different, stake to property. So it's like this twin, he's like a twin demon, of colonialism. And the question of going to Mars, this whole sci-fi fiction is also an expansion of this Israelite mythology that you speak about in your PhD. So, the first people claim is not only like, a question of like nativity to one particular land, but it's a nativity to earth in and of itself. So there's more questions to explore. But what are your thoughts on some of the ideas that have come up so far?
I think for me, my thinking is that I think maybe to as a response to Nati's thoughts as well, is in essence we're not even saying so Peter was a twin devil and laughter, sorry. I think the question in essence is not to state that Afrikaners are Africans. We're not trying to say that, but we're saying they assert themselves, as you said, Nati, through power and make themselves African. And they fashion themselves in different ways, in response to the political moment that they find themselves in. So, but I think when you draw from a Pan-African's viewpoint, they're not African, I don't even think you need to be Pan-African. There's a logic there. It's like they're not African, but they impose themselves and assert themselves as these natives who are African. And then, post 94, I think we had a discussion earlier on, they then get into this identity crisis, which is very strange, in whiteness studies, and I think there's work that needs to be done around South African whiteness studies and that identity question where now they're asking, am I really African? Am I not? I'm guilty. And the white work that they're doing in that phase. So it's a question of they're not African, but how do they assert themselves, as, world makers, as oppressors. And Richard, you had another question. think you made another point, but now I'm losing my train of thought.
On myth as a question of power.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of work to do around myths, right? Because and what I also found interesting is that they use, sort of truths as well. See these half truths or these small white lies, that they also insert as well. So definitely there's a lot of work, to do around mythology, and white mythology and as a question of power and how they put them together. No, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, so Smooth, thank you so much. Let me read some questions on the chat and then we'll give it to you to conclude, I suppose. And then thereafter, we will just conclude our session with more promises, obviously with some promises of other sessions to come. And I think your session was just such a powerful generator to what is to come and to give us direction on how to redirect Black radical discourse. So Josiah Simi was like, now I understand where I don't know, apartheid come from. Is that apartheid or maybe it's a different word that I'm not privy to. And then Lutando laughs at the comment of twin demons. I think yeah, these twin demons of Nazism and Afrikanerdom. I mean, Afrikanerdom is a species of Nazi nationalism. I mean, they had to go to Germany and fight on behalf of the Nazi, and were like, actually, we need to consolidate against the English and segregate the Africans. Through this system of separate development, because we can't genocide Africans at the scale at which we're doing in Poland and in East Europe. So now let us generate power in these means, right? Hoarding all land and resources. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like there's so many genealogies to be traced in how white people become who they are. And Untate Mabule is asking this question: how do we disentangle ourselves from European settler mythologies? That's a powerful question. In other words, how do we reclaim the African identity with land and being? Okay. Small concluding remarks, maybe in attempt to ask these mammoth-like questions that our ancestors have also been wrestling with.
Yeah. I think for me, what today's session says, and I think it speaks to the last question as well, is there's a lot of work that we need to do around South African historiography. There's a space for young Black people to reread the history and to then reshape, and demystify some of these and extinguish some of these mythologies, through research, argumentation, logic, etc., etc. So I think the session for me reminds me as well of my sort of own intellectual agenda, and I'm sure for a lot of people here, and that's the task that we have, So there's a lot of work, and I think with my particular personal research agenda, I think we also need to study white people like more intensely as well. I think there's a lot of work in Black study. We've done a lot of work on ourselves as Black people. We can also turn away and focus on the system that has really oppressed us. And this is not to say Black scholars haven't done enough work on white, but I think we could do way more, right? Around understanding. And I often find some colleagues of mine, you hear this when they read my titles, like, sure, you're brave, sure, you're brave. You're brave, and from some Black scholars, there's a fear of studying white people, and I don't get it. And for me, in sort of promoting this kind of research agenda, I think it's also very important. Not to say negate Blackness, don't study Blackness, but we can also, I think, strengthen ourselves intellectually, in terms of our activism, in also focusing and really casting the spotlight on whiteness and white people across the globe. Yeah. So that's my parting shot.
Yes, thank you so much, Sbu. And obviously, as a member of our family, of the Black House. We definitely support you in all the work that you do. And also keeping in mind that the Black radical tradition has always been a collective enterprise. Like you see these big names like, Cedric Robinson and the Peggy Petersons of this world and, the Joy James, all of those people have been and were working in collectives. And this is exactly the type of space that we are trying to generate and we've been generating. So as one of ours, we definitely support you in your mission. And we understand that it's a mission that is directed towards a grander vision of finally liberating Africa and the entire planet from the grasp of, white totalitarianism, because whiteness is a totalitarian project. And I just want to thank everyone who took their time. You've been with us all this while, and you guys have really, engaged with amazing and critical questions. Welcome to the Black House Philosophizing in Soweto series. Thank you to Dr. Maseko for being our first guest and leader of discussion. I think this has been also a very generative talk, and I think it's also leading us to think about what you're saying, Sibu, in terms of debating Black texts in the public domain, like the myth of 1652. So we might actually ask you back to come and debate this text, I mean, if there aren't any platform outside, why can't we create those platforms for ourselves?
Call the author, right? Call Patrick
Absolutely.
And to come and the myth of 1652, right?
Absolutely.
The lie of 1652. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're definitely on that, and we're on a number of projects. So thank you to everyone who's come. We hope that you join us again. So our next talk will be on apartheid studies and why it's important to restudy the problem of apartheid and how, this question of apartheid studies is resurging in South African academy amongst young Black scholars, what it means and how activists can also take up this question. We will definitely disseminate information, hopefully in the next 2 weeks, on who our speaker will be and when we'll have that speaker. So please, please, please make your way to the next conversation that Black House Philosophizing will be hosting on apartheid studies and really trying to understand what is apartheid without just understanding it as a regime of terror, because that's how we thought about it, as like a governmental structure, as a governmental regime from, 1948 to 1994. Now we want to understand apartheid in bigger conceptions, right? So please join us for that discussion, and you'll hear from us more in terms of what Black House has in store as an institution and what we have in store as a segment of Black House. Thank you, everyone. Let's see you next time. Yay.
Thank you,
and this will be on YouTube, so let your friends know, period. Okay, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.